Hi everyone, this video is following on from my safety and crisis planning video, and this is an area that I'm passionate about, which is addressing attitudes and stigma around people who self-harm or who are suicidal. As I said in my last video, this is from my lived experience. It is a truth, not the truth. People have lots of different experiences around this. My dog's just playing around there, please just excuse him. Also, just to say, I actually did a talk 2 years ago before I was even employed at that time. I hadn't long been back from treatments in South Africa, and I was asked to speak in an event to about 100 professionals about my experience of the emergency departments, and a lot of stuff that was in there I've used, and I've actually updated it with what I've learned over the last 2 years. So I'm going to be reading to you what I've written. Can I please just say that for anybody, I am not going into detail, but I'm talking about self-harm, suicide and trauma. So if this is a sensitive topic for you or it doesn't feel okay, I'm talking about attitudes as well around this, then just to let you know that that's coming, just really as a trigger warning. So I'm going to read to you, and this was when I became unwell in 2008, 2009, when I was referred back into services. When I was very unwell then, I would have defended what I did as normal or okay. And I know it was really difficult for my husband especially, and for the people in my life who loved and supported me. The intensity of my self-harm, even though I'd done it from my teenage years, but the intensity of it and I have to say that I think I was 36, 37 years old. People my age have issues with self-harm. The intensity of it escalated quickly, and I was no longer deemed able to safely cut. Sometimes that's one of the interventions that they put with managing people who self-harm is safe cutting. Because for me it had become life-threatening on occasion. In the time leading up to going to the treatment centre in South Africa in 2017, I had to be assessed by a surgeon one night as the doctor was concerned I'd punctured my internal organs. I ended up with dye being injected on one of those scanning machines, and I can't remember who said to me, but I was told that if I didn't stop this, I would end up dead or severely disabled within a short space of time. I remember that night, despite the haze that my life had become then. I remember lying on that scanning machine, bloated and nearly 7 stone heavier than I am now. I was on 20 plus tablets, antipsychotics, and thinking, this is what your life has been reduced to. On your own, lying on this table, nobody even to call. I took a taxi home that night on my own. The shame is still palpable, especially as I have a long history of anorexia and bulimia, and being exposed like that was dreadful. But I needed to survive, and self-harm was the fuel. It is only this year that I am beginning to understand the role that complex trauma has played in my self-harming and suicidal behaviour. Yes, they are different, but one can lead to another. I can step back now and listen openly to the horror and despair of those who loved me. My husband, who used to pick the kids up from school and come inside to check I wasn't lying in a pool of blood before he brought them in. I never did harm in front of them, but this is what he was living with. It eventually became too much, and I had to move out. I know every situation and every carer or supporter is different, but we cannot exclude them. They need heard and listened to, and can often provide invaluable information. I was very dishonest with the self-harm, not because I was a bad person, but because I was traumatized and in a system where I didn't feel truly listened to, heard, or seen. I had become my diagnosis, my symptoms, and I had become a risk assessment. I also didn't want anyone to take it away from me, because I didn't know how I could survive without it. I believe it's necessary to create spaces for staff who work with people who self-harm to be able to express the range of things that come up from them. I was asked to deliver and produce a lived experience session as part of risk assessment training that I gave with our clinical education centre, and I gave staff a case scenario very much like my own, And I asked them in groups to discuss what feelings, emotions, or thoughts came up for them. Someone who was constantly turning up in the emergency department, wasn't getting better, that kind of thing. There were lots of things that came up for them: hopelessness, powerlessness, anger, frustration, a desire to help but not knowing how, big difficult feelings and beliefs as well. This is no excuse for some of the harmful experiences I and others have had. But if we're going to address attitudes and stigma, I honestly believe that everybody needs heard. How can we change attitudes without creating opportunities for others to honestly look in, reflect in a safe, non-judgmental space, and become aware of their own internal narratives and judgments and beliefs that we hold? We all have them. Self-reflection, group reflection, education about these issues, support, and opportunities to learn from lived experience perspectives must happen. This is why I'm doing this video. I feel really passionately about this subject. I've had mental health challenges from the age of 14. I've also worked as a teacher, a lecturer, and a family support worker. I'm a mom, a daughter, I played in an orchestra, I was a competitive swimmer. But I became a mental health patient from my teenage years, and I took on that identity. I believe if we don't partner with people from the beginning, some of us get stuck in a system which we come to depend on. A cycle of learned helplessness kicked in for me. I've been diagnosed schizoid, schizoaffective, bipolar, major depression with psychotic features, anorexic, bulimic. In 2011, of course, I was diagnosed borderline personality disorder because of the self-harm and stuff. This I challenged when I got better, when I went to South Africa and got the treatment this year, end of last year, this year. And I've had many psychological assessments done. I did my own research and advocated for myself. And in January of this year, my diagnosis was changed to complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I leave off the disordered part. I am not disordered. Those who inflicted harm on me were the ones with the problem. I won't go into the BPD debate here. No time for that. But what I can say is all those labels left me feeling unseen and unheard, and I wondered when I was well enough to wonder, and I'd got off all those 20 plus tablets a day, I'd wondered why trauma was never diagnosed in all those years, despite services knowing my history. Starting therapy with an EMDR consultant specializing in dissociation is helping me begin to see why, despite all the labels, despite being well functioning for periods in my life, I always ended up unwell again. The underlying trauma was never addressed. In 2008, when my mental health rapidly deteriorated again as the untreated eating disorder reared its head, my self-hatred was intense, and I can say now that trauma has separated me from my body. We've never been friends, and I'm working on it. Hopefully going to get there one day, but it's almost like I consider my body and me as two separate things. After not being able to reach the low weights of my anorexic days and dealing with what I now know were flashbacks and implicit memory being triggered, I began attacking my body. Self-harm is not the same for everyone, and as such, treatment options should be available. I was given the MBT, mentalization-based therapy or treatments, I'm not sure which, and I actually ended up becoming worse. I was on over 20 tablets a day, had 3 times 12 sessions of ECT over an 8-year period, and I continued to worsen. Just when we thought that things couldn't get any worse, they did. We have to step back and ask ourselves, if someone is continuing to be so acutely unwell in and out of crises, what is going on? What needs are not being met? It's easy to locate blame with individuals for not getting better. Or I was too unwell to get therapy. And there certainly was no exploration as to what purpose the self-harm served. Calling self-harm a coping tool and those kind of phrases seems enlightened and less blaming. but can also then provide a quick, easy explanation for a far deeper, more complex problem or cause. And once again, people won't get the help they need. We really need to start listening. But our systems are set up to be risk averse and blaming. So managing risk becomes about ticking boxes, covering our backs, and not really looking into the why. I work in the system now, and I'm getting an understanding of why culture is so important around helping people with these issues, because of course staff are afraid. I have a quote which kind of sums up things for me of how I felt in that time, and it says this: "I'm not lost. I've simply wandered further into the darkness than you care to brave. Sometimes there are unspeakable things which happen to people, and perhaps in services we feel unprepared to go there." Perhaps it will also highlight the lack of appropriate specialist evidence-based treatments. I can only talk about self-harm in relation to complex trauma because this is my experience. And my experience is that I was in a system that seemed to need me to be able to narrate a timeline of events in order to be understood and thus be provided with the help that I needed. I did my best to do that, but looking back at a report that was done in 2014 when I was assessed by a self-harm team, I noticed a few things. First of all, my timeline of events that I give ages and dates that I actually don't remember as precisely as they are recorded. Not like that at all. That's something about trying to provide professionals with an understanding of what had happened to me in order to try and get help. Number two, and I have to just say this, there was a lot of shit missing in that report. You see, I'm not sure anyone asked what happened when I first disclosed about any trauma, because if you look at the research, it's really important how disclosure of trauma is responded to. What did happen was I ended up in a lockup ward where, because I was a danger to myself, I was put in a straitjacket, in a padded cell. Yes, those things really existed. That was back in South Africa. And I was stripped naked and left in a cold, concrete seclusion cell with no bed and no toilet, night after night. There is another 20 years of that I could add on to, and I'm not going to go into it. Thirdly, I noticed the language in the report. Deliberate self-harm, and one incident described me as spectacularly cutting my wrist. I suppose in some ways I should feel a bit proud that I managed to evoke such language. But yes, it was spectacular. I nearly died. I needed operated on. That happened because I was being sectioned again, and I decided that there was no hope. I wasn't getting help. There was no hope. I may as well be dead. I'm lucky to be alive. I won't start on why trauma approaches are so essential for people to start to heal, because there's almost like a whole piece that I'll talk a little bit about that, but that's almost for another discussion. Anyone working with people who self-harm and or are suicidal, I would suggest reading, if there's trauma, a book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and Healing the Lives of Fragmented Cells by Janina Fisher. These books, coupled with starting therapy with an EMDR consultant recently, is helping me realize a few things which I believe are really important to note on this topic. Patients who are in the mental health system long-term with seemingly unresponsive results to any interventions are often patients with complex trauma and underdiagnosed dissociative disorders. Given how the brain responds to trauma, expecting me, given the complexity of my history, to recount a clear narrative and timeline is in fact unreasonable, because the brain doesn't process it like that. Rehashing traumatic events can be re-traumatizing. If we think about this in terms of our system and how often we refer people from one part of a service to another, you're in addictions, you're in eating disorder, you're in self-harm, you're in personality disorder, you're in inpatient, etc., etc. Let's just think about that, especially for those with complex presentations. A traumatized body, a traumatized system needs to feel safe to begin to heal and process that. Are our clinical environments grounding, safe environments? Is there consistency in what room a person comes to for therapy or to see a key worker? Are mental health workers kept up to date with new trauma research, and do they know the importance of teaching traumatized, distressed patients how to ground and soothe their systems? Do our inpatient units, where there is one-to-one observations because you're at risk of harm, do they use that time to help support and educate people about how to ground themselves and help them feel safe? I got distracted there with the time. And need I say anything about language and attitudes? Dignity, respect, honesty, and openness. Do we understand that a traumatized person might react negatively to kindness because their experience of past abuse has been through grooming? And do we understand that traumatized individuals can fragment and develop different parts in order to survive? And unless people get the right help to understand the various roles that these parts played, they will continue to struggle because trauma is encoded differently to other memories. So when you assess me as the me in front of you, you don't realize that my self-harming part, which has served a clear purpose in my life, is not the same as the me who shows up to work or cooks for my kids or keeps a budget. It is the same with the suicidal me. Because complex trauma has created a complex system of parts to survive, we need to understand this. My EMDR consultant is helping me explore what purpose these parts have served, what they're trying to communicate, and what they need. They came about for a reason, and because of the science of trauma, they live on even when the threat is past. This approach changes the way I am spoken to, and risk is managed. Rather than feeling judged and shamed for maladaptive thinking or behavior, I'm learning to feel safe, accepted, and thus be more open to understanding myself and being able to share this so that the person working with me can also help support me. That is why suggestions to draw with red markers on the body or snap with an elastic band felt absurd to me. I needed to cut to cleanse and soothe and calm and stop the flashbacks and allow me to be so exhausted my head would be quiet for a while. Ritual, control, release, distraction, numbing, feeling. So much there. This all came with the me presenting all this history, time and again, year after year, to the emergency department. And with trauma and with having been labelled in a system and at times judged and stigmatized, so too exists deeply rooted shame. So when the wounds on my stomach or thigh were being assessed and people walked into the room, I didn't feel able to say, please lock the door. I often had internal and external stitches after hours sitting in a waiting room, adrenaline worn off, but unable to ask for pain relief because sure, I had done this to myself, I somehow deserved it. On the odd occasion I was told anesthetic doesn't help, so I didn't get any being stitched, and I couldn't speak up and say how painful it was. When my trousers were down and underwear soaking from disinfectants, I couldn't ask to have a blanket cover some parts or a towel to tuck in and keep me dry. In 2014, my self-harm worsened after being raped and badly beaten. Trauma upon trauma, shame piled upon shame. Of course, I wouldn't expect a busy emergency department, nor a crisis or ambulance team or GP to necessarily know my whole history. So I share my story in the hope it will at least make professionals think about the human being beneath the presenting problem. This is just a snapshot of my life. I have also referenced how I give a brief outline of how my diagnosis affects my crisis or safety plan, because that's really important, that document that's on the system, that if I were to turn up in any of these departments, people had access to the information. But people should care enough to treat every individual walking through your door with the same dignity, respect, and compassion you would afford one of your own. Pause for a second, breathe, think for a moment. This person in front of you just might be someone who is trying their best to survive in a world that they don't really understand, with experiences no one has helped them make proper sense of. These scars remind me of a time I was unable to find the words to express my inner turmoil. This is my story, and it's written on my skin.